Buenos días. Buenos días a todos y a todas, compañeros, compañeras. Hoy, 14 de septiembre de 2023, acá reunidos en nuestro seminario sobre reparaciones de la esclavitud y la colonización. Hoy para el cuarto día. Creo que ha sido una semana interesante, intensa, y estamos todos seguros que ustedes se llevarán en sus mentes cosas muy interesantes para debatir y para seguir estudiando. Hoy les quería traer una anécdota. Realmente quería compartir con ustedes algo que me ocurrió anoche, que vino la persona del censo a hacerme algunas preguntas. Estábamos con mi vecino que vive al frente, que es jefe de calle, y se encargó de organizar todo. Yo vi que eran muy poquitas preguntas. Y le dije, ¿pero esto es el censo o es una preparación, algo? Bueno, estamos utilizando la metodología de la pandemia, que era una cosa relativamente corta. Hay preguntas que no te hago porque ya se asume.
Don't ask you because we assume, for example, at the building, and usually they're more or less the same questions. So he quickly asked some questions, and since my neighbor was there with me, and he asks him questions as well. And one of the questions that he asks him is, what is his race? Like how? And I say, you didn't ask me that question. I told him, no, because as you said, what we see is evident, we don't ask about it. And what did you put down for me? White. And I said, or Caucasian, and I said, well, that question there is that of self-acknowledgement. You can't assume anything. In that question, in that sense, that question was an achievement of the struggles of the Afro-descendant people and Afro-Venezuelan people to have reflected in the census that how each one recognizes themselves in some Afro-descendant category. The question is an achievement, but this struck my attention because what's missing still is the censors, the people. It sounds those who conduct the census, that they understand what is the question about. This self-acknowledgement, self-identification of what you belong, where you belong to, what group. Because she was black. She was a black woman, and I asked her, and how did you qualify yourself? Just out of curiosity, because I put Afro-descendant. And said, well, fine, well, you have to ask me that too. Why don't you ask me that? Because because what you want to reflect is what we think about ourselves, and so part of our struggle is that we have to think of those small details which are important, and all the details. Person who asks the sentence, conduct the sentence, has to know that the question is just made in an objective way. No, it has to do with how the person perceives themselves. How do you identify yourself, if you're Afro-descendant or not, for example? So, and having said this, I tell our Sandy and everyone here, our friends from Curacao here, that here in the sentence we included that question of how did the question see themselves. And more than 50% of the population acknowledge themselves in some category that belongs to the Afro-descendants. 62% consider themselves Afro-descendants, where there are subcategories under sub-African descent. So even though some call like brown skin, it's all right. Brown skinned, yes. Black skin, Afro-descendants. So there are different categories or shades, but you choose. And 62% consider themselves Afro-descendants. And I think excellent, because there are white people who are in the sentence that you don't see them on the street. Where are they? Or, because you get in the subway and say, where are the whites? Where are the white people, white-skinned people? Because it said 30% whites, where are they? What are the things that, of the struggles that we are waging here in Venezuela, in order to achieve an acknowledgement of people's roots of our Afro-descendant roots. Well, I just wanted to share with you this short story of something that happened to me. We'll continue discussing. I give the floor again with our sister Isamar Ochoa. You have the floor, ma'am. Thank you, Guillermo. Good morning to you all. Welcome again to this space. In order to continue with the reflections that Sandew Hira brings this week, so many interesting ones. Yesterday we were speaking with him a bit on how the secularity of Western technology and science work, and how they work as an argument to justify their domination and domineering and their racist control and other ways of thinking by way of putting in the back burner our beliefs. So we are also speaking of different mechanisms of for colonization of the mind, the diverse ways as well of production of knowledge, different methods to study mental colonization. And we closed speaking a bit on how Nazism of the Holocaust were not short and exceptional elements of history, but they are better yet expressions of the constitutive colonialism of the way in which the Western thinking thinks. And today we are going to start with Sandew speaking a bit about decolonization of the mind from the Marxism point of view. Welcome, Sandew, again to this space this morning. We remind you again, please, to keep your cell phones turned off to avoid interruptions. Please, the retransmission is direct. It is being done from these sessions by way of the YouTube channel Reparations, Decolonization, in 3 languages: Spanish, English, and French as well. And with no more ado, I will give the floor to Sandew. And newly, we want to thank you all, especially those that are here present, as well as all of those who are connected online by way of Zoom and by way of the YouTube channels. Thank you very much. You have the floor, sir. Sir? No, I don't think there's a technical problem. No, you go ahead. Puedo se- pu-
Marxism didn't resonate with people of color. There were black Marxists, sure, many of them. And then I started reading M. Césaire, who had this critique of Marxism after he left the French Communist Party. And then when I studied decolonial theory, I developed a more in-depth critique of Marxism. But it's good to understand Marxism, and that's why we'll go to a word file so that you can see how Marxism of Western knowledge and of inferiority of non-Western knowledge. See, if you look at the biographies, I also take always the women who were, you know, part of Marxism, and Jenny von Westphalen, the wife of Marx, was born in 12 February 1840, before Marx. Marx was born 2 years later. Engels was born 2 years later, and Mary Burns, the first partner of Engels, who was in Ireland when Engels lived in Ireland, was born a year later after Engels. And Lizzie Burns, his second partner, the sister of Mary Burns, after she died, was born 6 years later. Now, in 1835, at the age of 16, Marx studied law at the University of Bonn. And a year later, he was engaged to Jenny. And then a year later, he started studying, that year he started studying at the University of Berlin. And Engels started to work as a mercantile apprentice of the family firm. His father was an industrialist, and they had this cotton farm in Barmen, in Prussia, Germany. He was 18 when he started working. And the intellectual development of Marx began when he wrote his dissertation on philosophy in 1941. He was 23 years old, and there he argued that theology must yield to the superior wisdom of philosophy. So Marx basically argued for secularism. And in that year, Engels performed military service in the Prussian army. He was 2 years younger than Marx, and he attended lectures at the University of Berlin. And a year later, Engels went to work in England, in Manchester, with the parent factory cotton mill, and he stayed there for 2 years. And Marx went to work in Köln, in Cologne, where he started working as a journalist for the Rheinische Zeitung, the Rhineland News. He was 24 years old, and so his intellectual development, writing articles, began at the age of 24. And after his dissertation. A year later, in 1843, he married Jenny. They had 7 children together, and only 3 survived adulthood. In that year, he moved to Paris because of the repression in Germany, and he became co-editor of the German-French yearbook. And there were many radicals in Paris, of German and French radical, and there is where we get the ideas of Marx, in the Rheinische Zeitung, in this yearbook. And then in that year, when he was in Paris, he wrote a critique of George Hegel's philosophy of right. And there is where he developed this idea that religion is part of the oppressor's class and is the opium of the people. That is where initially he came up with this idea. And then in 1844, he went to London. Paris, was become too dangerous. Sorry, not in 18. Engels went to London, and Engels started writing on economic theory, comparing economists with theologians, and published his first book. From 1843 till 1845, Marx started his study of political economy. He started studying the works of the British, the French socialists, Hegel's dialectics, and in 1844 he wrote the first manuscript on classical political economy, and there he developed a theory that capitalism and the conditions of work of capitalism led to alienation of the wage workers. The wage workers didn't feel that the products they were earning, they were producing, was part of their work. And in Paris, Engels goes to Paris, they meet there, and there they start collaborating. Engels published his book on the condition of the working class, explaining how the Industrial Revolution made it work. And because of repression, Engels leaves for Germany and Marx goes to Belgium. And then Engels comes later to Belgium to discuss with Marx. And then they wrote the first very important book that came the foundation of Marx, which is the German ideology, where they developed this idea that the base and superstructure, humans distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they start producing means of subsistence to support their needs. So the idea that the society consists of two parts, the base, the substructure and the superstructure, is developed in the German ideology. Now some people say, oh yeah, that is not Marx's idea, it's Engels' idea, and the idea of people who edited this one later, because the German ideology was a manuscript which was not published until 1932 in Russia. So people say, oh, that's not really Marx's idea, but in my view it was. And then in 1845 in Paris, they write together the book called The Holy Family. It was published in 1804, and it dealt with the idea of false consciousness, how false consciousness legitimizes the existence of the different classes. And then comes 2 years later, when they are working in Brussels, they were part of the League of the Just. That was a Christian communist revolutionary organization. And most of them were Germans, and they merged with another organization called Communist Correspondence Committee. And together they were known as the Communist League, and for the Communist League they wrote the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto developed the idea of historical materialism and class analysis. It says the history of all existing society is the history of class struggle. So it's important, the Communist Manifesto is not just a small book, it is the foundation of historical materialism. And when they were in Brussels, Marx publishes another book, The Poverty of Philosophy, which is also a critique of political economy. So the Communist Manifesto was written in a time where there was revolution in the whole of Europe. France, Italy, Germany, Austria, Denmark, Hungary, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Poland, Romania, Belgium, United Kingdom, Ireland. So Europe was in turmoil, you know. But Marx was then expelled from Belgium, goes to Paris, goes finally to Köln in Germany, and started a newspaper, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. Engels takes part in an armed uprising in Prussia. And all this fails, so the revolution goes down, and these guys move to London. Oh, and I have to be slower. Yes? Okay? Okay? All right. Okay. So then they are in London together from 1849. Marx is 31 years, Engels is 29, you know, and they don't move out of London anymore. So from London till they die, they live 30 years in London. That is where the collaboration started, and that is where the major works of Marx are written. Engels publishes an analysis of the German Passion War of the 16th century. Marx is a correspondent of the New York Daily Tribune. And in 1852, after the coup of Napoleon the First, he gives an analysis of the coup in a publication called the 18 Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And there he discussed how the relationship is between individual and let's say, the circumstances that determine the development of society. Can an individual change society? Or is society changed by class struggle and class dynamics? You know, and he says basically history is a history of class struggle, and individuals play a role, but a limited role. And the guy who developed this most was a Russian Marxist. His name is Plekhanov, and he wrote a book called The Role of the Individual in History. And Plekhanov was regarded as a very well-esteemed Marxist by even, although he was a Menshevik, but by Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin and all, they respected Plekhanov. And then, 1952, 5 years later, Marx writes a manuscript called The Foundation of the Critique of Political Economy, and in German it's very well known under the title Grundrisse der Kritik der politischen Ökonomie. It was published in 1939. But there, the elements of the book Capital, Das Kapital, that is where it was developed. And it discusses prices of production, relation of production, distribution, labor theory of value, the rise of technology, pre-capitalist information. So the Grundrisse is very important. And then in 1959, a year later, part of it is published in a book called A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. And then in almost 8 years later, 1867, Das Kapital, Capital Volume 1, is published, which is a critique of Adam Smith and David Ricardo. It develops the material conception of history, also the base and superstructure model. It goes into the laws of motion of the most. So Das Kapital is what everybody knew at the time of Marx. And then, in 1861 to 1863, Marx wrote 23 notebooks. And these notebooks were published in 1967, 1982. Very long after, and the only one who knew about it were Engels and Kautsky when they were preparing volume 2, 3, and 4 of Capital. Enrique Dussel wrote a book, The Unknown Marx, where he looked at these manuscripts and study it and make a commentary of it. But that is somewhat misleading, because if you hear the unknown Marx, you think it is about unknown ideas, ideas that people didn't know yet about Marx. But no, we already knew about these ideas. It was unknown because the manuscript was only known to Engels and Kautsky, and all the other people didn't know about the manuscript. Not because there were other ideas in it, because the ideas, political program by the German social democracy, and it's called the Critique of the Gotha program, and there he also deals with the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the difference between socialism and communism. In socialism, the system is set up in such a way that each individual gets wages according to the work they do, and in communism you get wages according to your needs, what you need, because then the society is very well developed. And then in 1878, Engels published a very, very important book called Anti-During. It is a survey of all philosophical concepts about nature and science. And there the theory of dialectics, the market theory of dialectics, is very well developed. He does that. And in that same year, his second wife dies, Lizzie Burns. And Engels published then the book Socialism in Scientific and Utopian Socialism, which was based on Anti-During in 1880. And in 1881, Marx and Engels began to discuss developments in Russia, and there they even talked about the idea that the Russian village commune maybe could skip the phase of capitalism, move directly to communism. And 2 years later, Engels writes The Dialectics of Nature, and then Marx dies in 1883. A year later, Engels published the book on the origin of family, private property, and the state, and that is where the concept of patriarchy is developed. And Engels publishes in 1893 volume 2 of Capital, and a year later volume 3. And Engels dies in 1895. And then Kautsky published the theories, volume 4 of Capital in 3 sub-volumes. Now, we could close the Word file and go back to the PowerPoint. So, what is important is to see that what Marx has done is develop a comprehensive, coherent, and integral theoretical framework. It's comprehensive because it produced concept of how to look at the most important dimension of society, how to look at world history, how to look at economics, politics, social relations, relations with culture. So Marx had, you can't say Marx had a view on class only. No, he had a view on many things. And it was coherent because they didn't contradict each other, they supplemented. They were consistent and logical. And they were integral because they had a base. And the base was the labor theory of value that says when you are in a society, there is surplus values. Surplus value is that you produce more than you can eat in a society. But when you're in a society, then the society is organized, class societies are organized in such a way that the ruling class takes the surplus value. And in slavery, it's just by brute force. But in capitalism, it's through the combination of the market and the private ownership of means of production. It's important. We go to the next. And we'll skip this one because I did it already, the unknown Marx. Yeah, and here are the key concepts of Marxism. Concept of surplus value, social theory of class. A class is defined by its relations to the means of production. The philosophical theories of dialectic materialism and historical materialism. The political theory of the state, that the state is an instrument of repression of the ruling class. And the cultural theory of modernity. Scientific knowledge is objective. Ethics and religion are not part of knowledge. And here is where the Eurocentrism comes of Marx. So he says the theory that we have developed, and Engels says it, is a universal theory. It's not a theory for Europe. It goes for Africa, it goes... So if I study Africa, I study it through class. And then the other element is, not only is it universal, it is objective. That means that what we have there is not ethics, it's not values, it's science. We look through a scientific glass to it, a society. And then here comes in the racism of the Enlightenment. The knowledge produced outside of Europe is inferior to the knowledge produced in the Enlightenment, and Marx is part of the Enlightenment. So if you come with, I think that Ubuntu is valuable, they would say, Ubuntu is not class analysis. You know, Ubuntu is not, it doesn't explain. If you come with Buddhism or so, this is inferior knowledge. They don't say it explicitly, but they say it, you know, in a general way. And then the next. So, what are the practical consequences of the Marxist theory? That is that if you think that capitalism is injustice through the private ownership of means of production and the market, then the conclusion is you should nationalize means of production. It's a logical conclusion. You should nationalize, and you put a planned economy. If you say the history of society is the history of classes, then the end game is communism abolishes classes. If you say that the only superior knowledge is the philosophy of the Western Enlightenment and religion is not part of it, basically you abolish religion or religion will die. If you say the state is an instrument of the capitalist class, then you destroy that state and build a new state, a worker state. You know? So these are the implications of the Marxist theory. And now I'm going to talk about how this theory was applied in Russia in the Russian Revolution. So we'll close this presentation and go to number 11. And then we'll deal with the experience of Russia. And here is the thing. In the Marxist theory, there is progress historically, from slavery to feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism. The idea that you get a socialist revolution and then you go back to capitalism, it's not in Marxist theory. It is impossible. And that happened in Russia. In Russia, you get a socialist revolution that ends, is rolled back. So, no. Yes. So the Communist Manifesto had put a lot of ideas of how to, what kind of measures should you take when you have a socialist revolution. You abolish property of land, you put a income tax, you abolish right of inheritance, and all these other things you might be familiar with. Next slide. And the Paris Commune, in the Paris Commune, Marx saw all these things. They abolished property, you know, they set up some kind of a planned economy. Next. Next. And then now, we'll see how in 1861, long after feudalism was abolished in England, in Russia, feudalism was abolished by law by Tsar Alexander II. And then in 1917, you get the Russian Revolution that is followed by 4 years of civil war, the White Terror. Many countries invading Russia after the end of World War I, caused 1 or 2 million deaths. In 1921, they set up the State General Planning Commission, Gosplan. and tried to set up a planned economy, but it couldn't work because of the war and the devastation. And then Lenin, who dies in 1924, introduces the new economic policy in 1921, where peasants were able to sell their products to markets. And only in 1929, they abolished the new economic policy and start with the first 5-year plan, which had a planning period of 1928 till 1932. Next. Now, what is important, people don't talk about it very much, but the social and cultural implication of the Russian Revolution was huge. You know, church weddings were abolished and civil partnership was introduced. So if you want to get married, in a former time, the only way to do it is to go to the church. And now you could go to, you know, the municipality and you are married. Divorce was forbidden in Christian Catholic Church. Divorce is a matter of choice. Abortion was legalized. Homosexuality was decriminalized and gay marriages were legalized. Can you imagine gay marriages were legalized already in the Russian Revolution? Well, it took the West, decades to do it. And if you read the books of Russian women at that time, like Alexandra Kollontai, you know, who wrote beautiful books on how male-female relations change, how sexuality changed because of the revolution. And then Russia consisted of many nationalities and many languages. And they, in the constitution, they got the right to separate from Russia and set up an own state. And what the most important, the Russians saw the revolution of theirs not as, they saw it as the start of a world revolution. So they set up the Communist International to coordinate you know, the liberation of the world. Imagine people thinking on that scale and that level. It's fantastic that solidarity is done in this way. You know, one of the things that attracted me to Marxism and Leninism was the Communist International. The idea that your struggle is not only your struggle, but you help people across the world. Then next. Then now, you get, how do you set up the economy? So all the means of production are in the hands of the state. The prices of goods and services are determined by the plan, not by a shop owner, because there's no shop owner. The state firms have an account at the central bank, so there's no banking system. There's no free flow of money. There are no markets where you can sell your product because the plan says, bring the shoes to that shop, and then you sell the shoes at that price. So the other thing is, there is full employment. When you have labor markets, then people might be unemployed. But now, the plan says, no, oh, we need 10 teachers. We make sure that we train people, and then you have 10 teachers. There's full employment. So you might think this is a fantastic system, right? Why did it not work? What went wrong in this? And the other thing is, when you study the economic growth of Soviet Union, it was even higher than the United States in the 30s and so. So you get the collapse of the Soviet Union. Let me see. Okay, yes. So I won't go into the economics. I'll go into what happens with the collapse, the next. So after World War II, the system economically began to become problematic. But the basis of the problems was that within the Soviet Union, under the Stalin regime, a social layer of people within the Communist Party developed that acted as a ruling class. They had dashas, great houses, they lived in welfare. And although the standard of living improved of people, the political repression that led to 10 million people being dead by Stalin, that created a society of fear and made that society unable to develop. And it went on after Stalin died, and what came after it, although there was de-Stalinization, still the system was repressive. And the economic problems became evident in the 1980s. Long shopping lines, empty store windows, broken cars, and the deterioration of the living standard. 1985, Gorbachev was elected as General Secretary of the Communist Party. Gorbachev explains how his grandfather were killed by Stalin. So the memory out there, and they are in power, and they are discussing how should we do now? Should we abolish central planning? Do we decentralize this? Do we introduce market? Do we restructure economy and society? And they use the term perestroika for the restructuring it. And then comes the thing, and do we open up the society for public discussion and political participation, what is called glasnost? Should we have perestroika and glasnost? There's a discussion that's going on. Meanwhile, in 1979, Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and that was a disaster. 10 years later, they had to withdraw. And Gorbachev gives an analysis where they stand. And he says, next, glasnost. Are we at that? No, sorry. Yes. So what Gorbachev does, he tries to end the Cold War with a treaty with the United States about the elimination of intermediate range and shorter range missiles. And then, you see, they try to withdraw from the ideology of communism and international solidarity. They withdraw support for Cuba and Nicaragua and the liberation movements in Angola, and try to figure out how they can come closer to the West. Glasnost, next. And what happened, what Gorbachev says, much what happened afterwards and is going on in Russia has its roots in the Stalin area. And with glasnost people discussing how to move forward, they discuss also the legacy of the Russian Revolution, including its theoretical foundation, Marxism. And then comes a lot of revelations. People who never talked about how their families were victims of Stalinism began to talk about it. But what happens if you talk about it? You form organizations to discuss it. 1987, all kinds of organizations rose independent of the party, and then they start discussing all kinds of things: democratization, political reform, and even the establishment of political parties outside the Communist Party. So, a new civil society. All right, yes. All right, it's too fast, yes. So, a new civil society arises. Then, you get an important discussion, decision on the 1st of July 1988. The separation of the party from the state. A new legislative body is introduced, the Congress of People's Deputies of the Soviet Union, a kind of parliament. And the first elections take place in March, and 80% of the candidates were still communist. But then, because it's a parliament, they broadcast the discussion in the parliament. And the first session was broadcasted between May 25th and June 9, 1989. And one person describes what happened. She says, as the days went by, speaker after speaker attacked one or another vice of the system. The inefficiency of the economy, the widespread poverty of the country, the corruption of the party, the scandals of hospitals without running hot water and healthcare without medicines, the inadequacies of education, the misconduct of the army in Afghanistan and Georgia, and finally, in one astounding outburst, the role of the KGB as an underground empire exercising comprehensive control over society. When the 12 days of the Congress were finished, the Soviet Union was a new country. The work of desacralizing the system began by Glasnost was now completed. Millions of people had heard their private thoughts uttered in public. Individuals saw that the evils they had observed in their own little corner of the system were common to the whole Union. And everyone now knew it was possible to say the boldest things without fear of retribution. So intense was the public interest in the Congress that industrial production dropped 20% during the televised coverage of the proceeding. Now, next slide. So all these discussions are taking on, and the Soviet Union being a federal union of 15 republics, which initially had the right to succession from the Soviet Union, but that right was taken away again by Stalin. In those republics, people were talking about independence. And in 1991, the Soviet Union was devolved into 15 separate states. Now, outside of the Soviet Union, in the Soviet bloc, in the Eastern Bloc, not the Soviet bloc, next. You see how in a very short time, changes are taking place. In East Germany, the Berlin Wall falls, and the Soviet army did nothing. In Hungary, a popular revolution brought down the communist system. Elections were held that brought conservatives to power. The same year, popular demonstrations in Czechoslovakia against the communist government. In 1989, the first multi-party elections were held, and formally central planning and the one-party system were dissolved. Now, in the Soviet Union itself, within 2 years, the Soviet Union dissolved. Look at the timeline next. June 1989, a month after the session of the parliament, in different parts of the country, workers went on strike to protest the economic condition, but then adding the political demand that says, stop with the leading role of the Communist Party. In the parliament, a group of liberal deputies, 250, led by Boris Yeltsin, formed a group that pleaded to end the leading role of the party, introduce multi-party system, private property, and a market economy. Yeltsin, who was a member of the political bureau of the Communist Party, resigned and became leader of the opposition against the party. Outside the Congress, groups organized under the banner of democracy, and they formed a coalition to contest elections in 1980, and they won in many cities. Yeltsin won in Moscow with 90% of the vote. So the new parliament elected Yeltsin as chairman, and then there comes presidential elections a year later that Yeltsin wins with 57%. So Russia, in Russia, the largest republic of the Soviet Union, and he immediately declared independence of Russia from the Federation and limited the application of Soviet laws on Russian territory. Then a coup comes, a military coup comes from the army in that year, 1991, against Yeltsin and Gorbachev, and the people mobilized against the coup, and basically the military had to withdraw. Yeltsin issues a decree banning all Communist Party activities on Russian soil. And then, in December 1991, formally the Soviet Union is declared as non-existent. And Gorbachev resigns in December 1991. The Supreme Soviet officially declared that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. Outside of the Soviet Union, where people like me and like many others were socialists, this was a horrible thing to see. You know, how is it possible that the country of Lenin goes through this and then socialism dies? You know? So obviously you know that the Americans are behind all the kind of manipulation. You think Yeltsin is an agent, you know, of the CIA. But then if you study it, you see that dynamics in that process that were, irrespective of the United States, working toward restructuring the Russian economy and society. And the Soviet ideology didn't have a way to deal with it and end it in this thing. So once Yeltsin took over, then another series of problems began. He freed prices, and that led to hyperinflation, which instantly impoverished the majority of the population and created a layer of capitalists who, for $1 or $2, were able to be owners of huge enterprises. The country was literally being looted and destroyed by the new property owners. And people say perestroika ended in katastroika. And that was true. So in 1969, Yeltsin barely won the presidential elections. In 1999, he stepped down as a president after a corruption investigation and appointed Vladimir Putin as his successor. So, next slide. Why did the Soviet Union collapse? You know, obviously for the liberals, it is because, it was about freedom. But when we discuss China, you see that it's possible to build a system that provides economic security, uplift people's life, provide a better welfare. If the system doesn't deliver a better life for people, then the only way you will survive is that people understand why. Why is it that it's going bad? And that they are prepared to go through the suffering. They are prepared to accept the suffering because they understand that the reason this is going bad is maybe like here economic boycott and other things. If people understand that, they will not come, they won't rise because they understand that what will replace it doesn't mean that it will get better. So people must see that the leading parties are preparing to improve your life. The experience of China, we could put up PowerPoint number 12. May 15, 1989, Gorbachev went to China. And then he says, economic reform will not work unless it is supported by a radical transformation of the political system. History proved him wrong. And the Chinese said to them, you're crazy, you're going down if you don't improve the economy first. Next slide. Now, the economic history of Communist China is important. The Communist Party of China was established on July 1st, 1921. Now it has 100 million members. You can't imagine. It's 3 times the population of Venezuela. So the scale of China is an important thing. It is so big, 1.4 billion people, you can't imagine it, you know, that. So October 1, 1949, they get a proclamation of the People's Republic of China. And then with the help of Soviet experts, in 1953, they start with the first 5-year plan. And the goal is to develop the country into an industrialized nation. You have central planning. It was, you know, everything like in Soviet Union. 1958 to 1962, you get the Great Leap Forward. And the aim was to catch up with the United Kingdom within 15 years. In the first year after the revolution, there was a distribution of land belonging to landlords to poor peasants. And it changed everything. Private ownership was abolished. All households were forced into state-operated communes. And the target was to increase grain production, to feed the cities, and earn foreign exchange through exports. At the same time, there was an effort to set up a massive steel industry that extracted workers from agriculture. Now, next slide. And the results of the Great Leap Forward was disastrous. 16 million peasants were relocated to cities to support the expansion of the industry. And behind these statistics, you see the peasants were not eager to join the communes, and then they were branded as capitalists. And in the villages, sharp political conflict arose, agricultural production dramatically fell, and you get famine in China that costed 16 million people their life. And then in 1962, Mao Zedong does an evaluation of the Great Leap Forward, offers self-criticism, and takes a step backward. And Liu Shaoqi, the second president of China, formally attributed 30% of the famine to natural disasters and 70% to man-made mistakes. So new reforms were announced that allowed free market and household responsibility for agricultural production. But then, the supporters of Mao organized against this new trend And under the leadership of Mao and Lin Biao, the vice chairman of the Communist Party, they launched the great proletarian cultural revolution that lasted till 1967. And the aim was to purge the Communist Party and government from bourgeois elements that had infiltrated these institutions. Mao's little red book with his sayings became the ideological guidance for millions of activists who formed the Red Guards and revolutionary committees. Millions of party members were accused of being landlords, counter-revolutionary and rightists. They suffered public humiliation, imprisonment, torture, hard labor, seizure of property, execution, and harassment into suicide. Millions of urban intellectual youths were sent to the countryside, to mountainous areas of farming villages to learn from the workers and farmers there. According to Wang Hunun, a member of the political bureau of the Communist Party, more than 100 million people's lives were attacked and 20 million died. These are huge numbers. After the death of Lin Biao, who perished in a plane crash, Mao returned to a small group of people led by his wife, Ying Yang, later called the Gang of Four, for support. The Cultural Revolution went on, but then the victims had a pushback. In 1969, Deng Xiaoping was sent to the Xi'an country tractor factory to work as a regular worker. A year earlier, he was being tortured. His son jumped out of the window of a 4-story building and became paralyzed. 4 years later, Zhou Enlai, premier, who had a lot of respect in the party, brought Deng back to Beijing. And he built a following in the party and the army. And when Zhou Enlai died in 1967, and Mao Zedong a few months later, the group arrested the Gang of Four, and the wife of Mao committed suicide. And at the 11th Congress of the Communist Party that was convened in 1979, the Cultural Revolution was officially declared over. And here comes Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping charted out a new course for China, saying, we need to move. The aim of our revolution is to liberate people. In order to liberate people, we liberate the production forces. So, in order to expand the production forces, we can make use of the market economy under the leadership of the Communist Party. This is unheard of in Marxism, because Marxism says, no, this is impossible. And then he comes and says, we must emancipate our minds in order to answer the question, what is socialism about? We don't look at textbooks. We look at the reality of us. If the economy remains stagnant and the people's living standards are at a low level, we can't say that we are building socialism. Socialism is not building poverty. Socialism is building welfare. And he says capitalism has developed for hundreds of years. So how do we build socialism? By creating a socialist market economy, take the creativity of entrepreneurs and develop an economy that enable us to lift people out of poverty. And then he says the Cultural Revolution was a big error. But it was not only an error of Mao Zedong. We were there. We supported it. So we can't criticize, I did it, Zhou Enlai did it, all the others in the Central Committee did it. And I became a victim of it, but I was responsible. So you can't forget what Mao has done and then suddenly vilify Mao. You could see what has the good things, what are the bad things he's done, and what were our responsibility. This tells you something about the culture of discussion that we're going on there. And he says now, socialism is superior to capitalism. And it is superior because we are in a better position to uplift, to use the economy to uplift the welfare of the people. So China's modernization can be achieved only through socialism. And what is socialism? And what is the concept of the market economy? He says, it is wrong to think that a market economy only exists in a capitalist society. There were other societies in feudalism where markets existed. So if market can exist outside of capitalism, why can't it exist in socialism? It's logical, eh? He's thinking logical. But how will it function in socialism? He says it will function like this. We decide how capitalism develops, not the capitalists. We are telling the capitalists, now you can set up enterprises, but these are the rules you have to obey. You can go, you can invest, you can do your creativity, you can invent, etc. And you can do that only in order to uplift the welfare of the people. So he says, because people are arguing in the party, but will capitalism then cannot come back? He says, you know, people think that by having private companies under the leadership in a socialist market economy that is led by the Communist Party, sooner or later the Communist Party will be overtaken by the capitalists. He says, you don't have to be afraid for that. Why? Because we are going to make sure that this doesn't happen. Because we are going to train our party. We're going to continually educate the people to make sure that it doesn't happen. So, he says, as long as we educate the army, the people in the organs of the state, in the party, that the purpose of introducing a socialist market economy is not to build capitalism. The purpose is to build socialism. So the party has a crucial role to play in the economy. Now, the Chinese come up with a strategy to uplift people from poverty. And they have done an amazing job. Incredible in world history that within 40 years, 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty. How did they do it? They had land reform. They had infrastructure development, transportation, roads, railway, public transport, electricity. They provide basic services, food, clothing, medical care, hospital, housing, education, cultural services, social security. They created democratic structures on the levels of villages and municipalities so people get involved. And they changed the mindset by giving people better access to internet, to travel to other regions, get involved in innovation, technology. Fighting corruption is a major thing because obviously we'll have corruption, and corruption is the virus to bring the system down. So you set up an administrative system to identify the people who qualify to participate in poverty alleviation. And the way they did it is really, really amazing. So they identify, they send out members of the Communist Party to a village. And then the responsibility of that party member is to make sure that you have 15 or 40 people living in this village in poverty. You know their name. The party member has now to analyze, why is he in poverty? Is it because he's uneducated? Is it because he doesn't know how to get a credit from the bank while he wants to set up a business? Is it because the roads are bad? What is it? The party member is doing that. You see, it's not the state, it's a party member. And then when he's identified it, he has to make sure that he puts up the measures for it. If it's a bank credit problem, then I make sure that you go to the bank and that the bank responds to you. But when the person has uplifted, and the party member goes to stay there for 2 to 3 years. It's not, I'm going to see, you go and get a credit, okay, I make the contact with the bank, see you later. No, that's not the way. They live there. And they say, okay, make sure that you... And they make a report to the party and say, these 15 people, Mr. and Mrs. XYZ, are poor now. In 3 years, they got a credit, they have housing, they have a television now. They make this report and then send it to the party. And then the party goes to the university and say, you're not part of the party. Send researchers to see if our cadre hasn't lied. Has he made it up? Because if he does, he will be punished. So the academic comes there, makes a report, sends it to the party, which is independent now, and says, okay, the guy lied or the guy spoke the truth. And if he spoke the truth, or if he lied, but even if he spoke the truth, still they send now a second party member there to check whether what the academic and the other have son has worked. And then after a few years, they keep in contact with the party member, with the people, to see if they don't fall back in poverty. Has they lost their job? What has been done? This cannot be done in a capitalist society. Uplifting people out of poverty is impossible to do it with these methods. You see? So the Communist Party was very much involved in the economic uplifting of the people. It's not just that the company was set up and they got job and they got higher wages. It's not that. In this process, 1,800 party members died because they died of sickness, overwork, being injured, etc. India has uplifted 400 million people out of poverty. China has done more. They're the same population. But the mechanism in India was not a party. It was just private companies. They set up new companies, people get a job, etc. So, if you want to see the progress of China, you'll see it in some statistics. In 1949, 80% was illiterate. In 2080, 3%. Life expectancy was 36 years in 1952. In 2020, it was 77 years. The income per capita in 1949 was $600 US. It was 5,000 20 years later, in 2020. So, poverty, when people are poor, it's not just a state of the economy. It's a state of the mind, of the culture, of your ability to cope with hunger and diseases. Poverty is a horrible thing. You see, it degrades you as a human being. So in order to uplift people, then what you do, the difference between urban and rural areas, because the poverty is in the rural areas, you decrease that. Housing programs, which enables people to build and rent housing. Decent clothes, safe drinking water, garbage disposal, sewage treatment, soil and water conservation, medical services, libraries, culture, all these things comes when you move from poverty to a normal standard of living, a basic standard of living. People can find work, you know. So the poverty of alleviation in China is not just about the income. It's about the whole lifestyle of people. So China's program uplifted people from poverty, but it also uplifted non-poor people to the middle class. For example, the middle class in China, which is defined by people earning between $700 and $1,800 per year, has risen from 39 million in 2000 in 20 years' time to 700 million. It's huge, you know. It's a fast increase in the domestic market for consumer goods, a big impetus for economic development. By the end of 2020, China had 1 billion internet users. Every year, 130 million Chinese leave China. They go to visit abroad for vacation, for study, for leisure. 90.9% return to China. If they didn't like, if they were unhappy in China, they wouldn't do that. Now, how did they create this new society under the leadership of the Communist Party? They built new cities. When I'm talking about new cities, I'm not talking about an old city that is being upgraded. 600 new cities has been formed since 1949. Fully master planned manufacture centers of economic and social life, some in desert land, in reclaimed islands. They have the most extensive high-speed railway infrastructure in the world. Between 2008 and 2029, they had 40,000 kilometers of high-speed roads, and they will expand it to 70,000 kilometers. And it will connect a lot of people in China, the rural people with the cities. And compare that to the United States. They have how many? One high-speed rail train. In China has already had about 10,000. China is developing 6G internet already. And while we're operating with 4G and maybe 5G. And 6G comes with virtual reality, artificial intelligence. And China has already the base infrastructure for it. China has now its own space station. Imagine that, a space station that is bigger than the old one which the Russians and the Americans built. And this is the most important one. If you go to the slide with the graph of the Chinese progress, here you see something amazing. In United States, which used to be the country, the richest country of the world, if you want to measure how big is an economy, they look at the gross domestic product. What do the people produce every year? And already in 2020, around 2021, China had surpassed United States. China is now the biggest economy, led by communists. And then you get another thing. The Communist Party, the support for the Communist Party is big, it's very big. How do we know that? Because an American institute of Harvard University, since 2003, has regular surveys, annual surveys of the support, the approval rate for the president and for the government. It is between 85 and 90% for year after year after year. Average in the United States is 50%. So the West is saying this is a dictatorship and the people don't support it, but the American survey says that they are being supported. And then I'll go to the last thing. How did this come about? I told you about Deng Xiaoping, but now we are seeing a new development. Mao Zedong was a classical Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist, and he viewed Chinese culture and Confucius as feudal. Confucius says Mao Zedong is a feudal philosopher. Then comes Deng Xiaoping, and Deng Xiaoping doesn't bother about Chinese culture. He uses creativity, imagination, and adapt Marxism. He says, we are going to build socialism with Chinese characteristics. And now comes Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping says, yes, we are building socialism with Chinese characteristics, but we're going a step further. We are rejuvenating the Chinese civilization. It's not about class. It's not even about nation. It's about civilization. And he wrote a book called How to Read Confucius and Other Chinese Classical Thinkers. And he goes into how these thinkers what they were saying, and take them step by step, one by one, and says, okay, this scholar says, for example, I'll take one example. He takes a philosopher, Xu Xi, who lived around 1200. And he takes a quote, he says, so she says, if you can one day renew yourself, do so from day to day. If you could do it once, you could do it always. And Xi Jinping says, the spirit of innovation is the most distinctive gift of the Chinese nations. We have a highly developed culture, so we are able to renovate ourselves day by day. So he goes back, not to Marx, he goes back to the Chinese philosophy, and there is where he brings his thing. And you see creative thinkers in China taking up the idea of China as a civilization state, not necessarily as a socialist state. I will leave it like that because I want to go to Iran, because it's important for us. Iran, Russia, and China are partners of Venezuela. And you need to understand these partners. You need to understand what is going on there. You know, you need to understand their philosophy, their history. You need to know where they come from. You need to know where they go. So I'll close this presentation and take the presentation of Iran and the experience of Iran. And China and Russia are socialist revolutions. Anti-imperialist and anti-colonial socialist revolution. Iran is anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, but not a socialist revolution. A revolution based in Islam. So what you do, you study. If you want to understand Iran, you have to study the history of their philosophy. And in the West, if you base your information on the West, you can't understand Iran because this has mullah and medieval and etc. That is a stupid approach. Even if you are against them, it's stupid. If you want to understand them, you have to study them. Take Khomeini, for example. Khomeini says Islam is a religion of those who struggle for truth and justice of those who clamor for liberty and independence. It is the school of those who fight against colonialism. He links Islam to the fight of colonialism. And the fight is about liberating the colonized countries, and a lot of them were Islamic countries, and establish a new society based on Islam, because Islam is progress. While the West says Islam, if you put up an Islamic state, then you put up a backward state. And he says, no, no, we put up a modern state based on Islam. To understand Khomeini, you have to understand Al-Afghani. Now, probably nobody heard of Al-Afghani. Who is Al-Afghani? Jamal ad-Din Al-Afghani is a not Pan-Africanist, you have Pan-Africanists, it's a Pan-Islamist. There were people who were saying, we are going to unite the Ummah. The Ummah is a community of Muslims. But in order to do that, we have to understand colonialism. Al-Afghani traveled a lot and was in India, Iran, Ottoman Empire, the Turkish. And he says, we must identify the colonizer as the root cause of our backwardness. And then he goes into a philosophical discussion with the European Enlightenment. He says, one might say that science has made astonishing progress among the Arabs. So the seeds of Islamic theological and philosophical sciences, you know, were Baghdad, were Istanbul. And what we did is, when the Europeans were still in the so-called Middle Ages, they didn't know about the Greek philosophy, the Greek mathematics, the Greek politics. We translated the Greek in Arabic and then brought it to Europe via Cordoba in Spain. Cordoba had the biggest library in the world at that time. We've been to Cordoba. It's amazing to be there in the mosque, which is also a church, and to see the magnitude of that building. So Al-Afghani is saying that we are the ones who saved Greek science in order to be able to bring it to you so that your enlightenment could be based on it. So don't say that we are backward. Don't come with us. So Al-Afghani was the inspiration of many Muslims who were fighting against colonization, you see, and also for Iran. Now, we go to the slide 6 on pre-revolutionary Iran. So you have to understand revolutionary Iran, you have to understand pre-revolutionary Iran. And in Iran, with a population of 84 million people, 90% belong to the Shia branch. Now in Islam, you have two big schools, the Sunni and the Shia. The difference between these schools are big. There are philosophical differences, there are theological differences, but the simple way people think about it is the origin of the conflict was when the Prophet Muhammad dies. The question was who would be the successor? And you have his nephew, Ali, and his followers claimed that he would be the successor of the Prophet, and that Abu Bakr, which was the leader, the eldest leader of the community, and by age, etc., claimed to be the successor. And from there, you get all kinds of other differences, and the followers Ali are called Shia, and they are in Iraq, in Iran, obviously, the Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, in 1921, a coup organized by the British led to the establishment of the Pahlavi dynasty headed by Reza Khan. 30 years later, 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh became Prime Minister of Iran. He nationalized Iran's oil industry, became enormously popular. 2 years later, the US and British intelligence agency organized a coup against him and overthrew the government and established a ruthless dictatorship under the Shah, and turned Iran from a fully secular state, from a religious state in a fully secular state, but with the Safak, the intelligence, crushing all political opposition. Now, in February 1979, the people of Iran overthrew the Shah. 1979 is an important year in world history, because here in Abiyala, you had the Nicaraguan Revolution. You have the revolution in Grenada, led by Maurice Bishop. So, under the leadership of Ayatollah Khomeini, the people overthrow the Shah. They hold a referendum to rename Iran as the Islamic Republic of Iran. 93% was in favor of it. In December, there was a second revolution about the constitution of Iran, because an Islamic republic needs to have an Islamic constitution. 99% voted for it. And then study the constitution of Iran to understand Iran. The constitution says that, the Ummah, the Islamic Ummah, is what they are trying to build, the unity, which is the community of Muslims. They are not building a nation. They are not building Iran. They are building the Ummah. And what differs this revolution from other is, it says, the constitution says that after experiencing the anti-despotic constitutional movement and the anti-colonial movement centered on nationalization of the oil industry, the Muslim people of Iran learned from this costly experience that the obvious and fundamental reason for the failure of those movements was the lack of an ideological base. Why did Mossadegh fail? He didn't have an ideological base. So the constitutions, I'm quoting from the constitutions, in the view of Islam, the government doesn't derive from the interests of a class. They don't adhere to class analysis, nor does it serve the domination of an individual or a group. It represents the crystallization of the political idea of a people who bear a common faith and a common outlook. It intends to establish an ideal and model society on the basis of Islamic norms. The mission of the Constitution is to realize the ideological objectives of the movements and create a condition conducive to the development of man in accordance with the noble and universal values of Islam. Now, you see that it's not only about Iran, it's about an international community of the Ummah. And now the constitution have to set up a political order. And then they say this political order should be democratic. People should get involved in running their own lives. So the Constitution provides the basis for this participation of society at all stages of political decision-making process. So you shouldn't be democratic only at the national level. You should be democratic at the local level, on the village, on the community, etc. And the Constitution refers to a verse in the Quran that says, we wish to show favor to those who have been oppressed upon earth and make them leaders and inheritance. The oppressed should become leaders of their own destiny. Now, the Constitution gives the right to every Iranian the same right that the West gives them. The West liberal democracy. Freedom of expression is in the Constitution. Freedom of organization and assembly. Protection of all human, political, economic, social, and cultural rights for men and women. Freedom to form political parties that contest parliamentary elections, universal suffrage. All these things, Iran has a parliamentary democracy like in France. But this is religious, not secular. They have different political parties. Sometimes the conservatives win, sometimes the program of you can't use conservative and progressives, you know, the more anti-colonials maybe you might say. So all these rights of Western democracy are enshrined in the Islamic constitution. And there are extra articles. One extra article says on women. They say, men and women equally enjoy the protection of the law and enjoy all human, political, social, cultural rights. Women's rights should be ensured in all respects because of the greater oppression that they served under the previous regime. There should be an extension of their rights. The government should create a favorable environment for the growth of women's personality and the restoration of their rights, both the material and intellectuals. The government should provide a special insurance for widows and aged women. It's in the Constitution. That is not even in the Constitution of France, a special section of women. It's in the Constitution of Iran. I say that because the Western liberal propaganda against Iran is on women. They wear headscarves, etc. And the Constitution says, I guarantee your right as a woman, you know, to develop yourself. And then, how does this Constitution work in practice? And one of the things I find amazing is this. People outside of the West try to construe a society. How do we live together? How do we set up our rules and regulations? In the West, yes? Now, all religions, the monotheistic religions, struggle with the question of sexuality. Judaism, Christendom, Islam struggle with how do we deal with sexuality? How do you look at sexuality? And Iran, like in some Christian countries, LGBT is forbidden. So you see that, hey, it is a backward country by the standards of modern liberal democracy. And you think they can't solve it. And this is an interesting story I found of Faraydun Molkora. It was a man and wanted to become a woman. He's a transgender. His family didn't approve. The nobody approved. He consulted a psychologist. He went to an Ayatollah before the revolution. And the Ayatollah says, I can't help you. You know? He went to the wife of the Shah, can you help me? No. After the revolution, he went to Ayatollah Khomeini. And he says, look, I fought in the war that Iraq invaded Iran. I'm a Muslim, I'm dedicated to the Iranian revolution, but this is my problem. And then Khomeini said, look, here is a Muslim. He has a problem. How can I solve it? I have to go to the Quran. I have to go to the Hadith. I can't, if there is something of God, I can't change that. So let me study again the Quran, let me study again the Hadith, and see if I missed something. And after study, he says, I've missed something. Sometimes nature does something, puts a woman in a woman in a man's body that should not have been done. And God, if it would be able to correct it, it would. Because God respects and loves the human being. So, Khomeini said, we need to support you in doing an operation which makes you a woman. But of course, we are not doing for you personally. It should be a policy. Now, transgender operations in the Islamic State of Iran are free. And every facility for transgenders are created in Iran. But you don't hear about this in the West. You see? I'm saying this when I say that in Venezuela, we're talking about reparations, I go to reconstruction, I go to reconstruction of civilization, and then I say, we need to study the other civilizations and not stick with what we already knew from Marxism, liberalism, Western. And then, my point is, if they can solve the transgender problem, why do you think in the future they might not solve the LGBT? So I don't use the LGBT as a stick against the Iranian revolution. So here's the interesting thing. The Iranians, after the revolution, we're going to set up a society. The Constitutional Court interprets the Constitution. So when Parliament takes a law, you can go to the Constitutional Council and say, hey, is this law against the Constitution? And then the experts in the Constitution, many countries have this. I think Venezuela might have it also, Constitutional Court, right? So the Constitutional Court consists of 6 experts in Islamic theology, 6 experts in Islamic jurisprudence, and is led by the Supreme Leader. And the Supreme Leader is the head of the state. And the President is the head of the government. So in Iran, Khamenei is the head of the state. You know, and I forgot his name, Raisi, is the head of the government. In France, the president is the head of the state, and the prime minister is the head of the government. Now, the supreme leader is elected by another institute called the Assembly of Experts. And the Assembly of Experts are 88 members, and they are elected by popular vote. Article 14 says, the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran and all Muslims are duty-bound to treat non-Muslims in conformity with ethical norms and the principles of Islamic justice and equity, and to respect their human rights. So they are basically, if you're atheist, fine, you could, you know, we respect your human rights. freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. You could have your own newspaper, fine, it's up to you. You're atheists, do it. They go even a step further. The Constitution says that the political system should be representative of the ethnic groups. So the religious groups have reserved seats in parliaments for specific religious group. There are 270 members of the parliament. And they reserve, and the overwhelming majority is Shia Muslim, but the Zoroastrians and the Jews will elect from their community one representative each. Assyrian and Chaldite Christians will jointly represent one representative. Armenians in the north and those in the south will have each one representative. And the limits of the number of people will be determined by law if the demographics changes, you see. This is a state where there is no separation of religion and state. And it offers more freedom and democratic rights than a secular state. A secular state doesn't offer this protection to religious minorities. A secular state doesn't have this proportional representation and a pluriversity. So, you see, the Iranian Revolution sees themselves as anti-colonialists. When they took power in 1979, the United States organized a military intervention in Iran by taking Saddam Hussein as a partner, giving him chemical weapons from Germany, and 1 million people in Iran were killed by a war that lasted for 8 years. And who supported that war? Russia. Russia was one of these supporters, organizers against Iran. Look where we are today. How is it possible? Now, understand that Iran sees itself not just as a nation, a state. It sees itself as an anti-colonialist force in the world. So that's why when they look at non-Islamic states, then those states who are anti-colonialists but inspired by Marxism, liberal democracy, whatever, are potentially their friend. That's why Iran looks at Venezuela as a friend, because Venezuela is anti-colonialist. But then there's a question, does Venezuela see Iran as a friend? But of course, Iran is not socialist, Iran is religious. And the socialists have learned, we mistrust religion. You see? So this kind of conversation is an interesting conversation to be having. And that is only possible if you take the Here is the interesting thing. Ayatollah Khamenei, the head of the state, gave a speech that reminds us of the speech of Kwaitumak. When Kwaitumak says, the sun will rise again after colonialism ended. And Khamenei says the great ideal of our revolution is to establish a new Islamic civilization and preparing for the rising of the sun of the greatest, civilization. The goal is to establish an Islamic government in Iran, but we are not only talking about Iran. It's not just for Muslims. He says, the world of Iran has a responsibility to breach a spirit into the world, that creates a new environment, opens a new path, a new Islamic civilization. This doesn't mean conquering land. It doesn't mean violating the right of nation. It doesn't mean imposing one beliefs and culture to other nations. It means offering a divine gift to nations so that they can choose the right path of their own volition, their own choices. So in the world, Iran says, we are Islamic, but we are not going to impose Islam on you. We can live together in a dialogue of civilizations. So I've dealt with Russia, China, and Iran, and I said that what you see in the world now is that when people seek to address colonialism, they seek an answer to the question, where are we going? They go beyond the European Enlightenment. They don't look at the European Enlightenment for answer. The socialists do, the Marxists do, but the majority of the world thinkers and philosophers are looking at other sources. If you are a Muslim in Iran, you look obviously to the Quran. If you are a Chinese now, you look to Confucius. If you are a Russian, you look to Genghis Khan. If you are a Hindu, you look to the Vedas or Buddhism. If you are in Venezuela, where do you look? It's a question that you need to answer. And I have interesting discussions with my brother Guillermo all the time. I love the discussions and I learn a lot. And a few things that I learned from him is that when I ask him, where does the idea come from? Outside the European Enlightenment, outside Europe, and now, obviously, the one that has done the most thinking, Hugo Chavez. Look at the speeches, the deeds. So if you want to construct a theoretical framework for liberation in Venezuela, if you look at all these, and even if you look at Chavez, Chavez looked at Marxism, looked at socialism, and see some things we can use and something it's not so. So we call our socialism the socialism of the 21st century. You see? Now, what you see, these are people who are thinking. And you have people who are not thinking but copying. So the people who copy work like this. They look at China and they say, hey, China has gone the great thing. We should copy China. But China is 1.4 billion people, has other history, different philosophy. You can't say you copy. But copiers are not people who think. Copiers are people who don't think, they copy. And the kind of things you need to create are people who are thinking. And then you move from reparations, looking at reparations, to reconstructing. You construct new things, you construct new ideas, you construct new theories. And I just dealt with three, Iran, China, and Russia because of the relation with Venezuela. But there are others. India is interesting to see what's going on there now, and probably other regions as well. So I will conclude with this and open up for question and discussion.
Ah, el único. Y Jean de Curazao. Por más nada. Aló. Muchas gracias, Sandew, por esta disertación de hoy. Estamos como cortos de tiempo hoy, así que piensen bien preguntas para mañana. Hoy vamos a tener nada más 2 derechos de palabra. Para mañana, ¿qué quiere? De verdad estamos... Entonces quería darle la palabra a nuestra amiga Jean Enríquez. Ella viene de Curazao. Vino toda la semana para estar aquí acompañándonos a nosotros y a nosotras. Entonces quería invitarla a que diera un saludo por acá para todas y todos. Max, no.
Thank you very much. I am very happy of coming here. I have been working with Sandew and his wife. I have learned a lot about decolonizing the mind. And we have also applied some of these in Curacao. But coming here has helped me to deepen my knowledge on this topic. And of course, the aspect on how we're going to continue deepening in a creative way regarding the responsibility and the task we have in Curacao. As you may already know, we're still a colony in Curacao. So the first political fact must come for becoming an independent country, and we cannot do that by ourselves. We need the help of everyone, particularly Venezuela. And we have been witnesses that we are close geographically, but very far from others also, in terms of ideology. When working, we need each other. We also need to comprehend your struggle in our work against blockade, and also about looking other ways to teach other people. We have achieved being able to establish contact with different networks that we hope will help us in the work we perform. I would like to continue embracing each other for the following of the struggle and our work in the struggle. Tomorrow in the morning, we are leaving, unfortunately, but with all the richness and a lot of energy from everything we need to do. So thank you very much to all of you, and of course to Sandew, because he has made this possible. Thank you very much again. Good morning, my name is Max Elstak. I came with Jean Enriquez, who's the director of the Tula Museum of Curacao. As you may already know, Tula was a slave, a leader, that in the same year as José Chirinos and José Caridad González were having a rebellion here in Venezuela that same year, but in August, He rebelled in Curacao, and now he's one of our national heroes. And precisely because of that, I am very thankful with Professor Sandew, because you made this journey possible for us. And because when we're here, we find multiple professors, historians, and individuals with huge knowledge about the past of slavery and Afro descendants, something we're very interested in, because in Curacao, as the Professor Enriquez already said, our country is still part of a colonial system between the Dutch and the European. We are working very hard to bring a different kind of knowledge that's based on our past as Afro descendants. We are working tirelessly, and that's why I'm very thankful with you. For example, Professor Argenis, Professor Carmen, and many others with whom I've had conversations regarding Afro-descendancy. And we'll try that all of that knowledge and the new friends we made today and during the whole conference to continue deepening and keeping that contact alive. We will come back to Venezuela because there's a lot of information here we can use, and that's why we're very thankful for what we have experienced during the days we were here. Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart, and I hope we can keep in touch. Thank you to all of you. You always give us energy. We will open the floor for one question, and then tomorrow we will receive more of them with more time and more calmly. Good morning or good afternoon, I think. Very quickly, 2 days ago I was talking to Professor Sandew that I had a proposal on what we have discussed during these days, and also those who were in the second seminar, so we've been following closely the whole process. One of the issues I wanted to address, and it was mentioned in today's session, the fact that the colonization of the mind is seen maybe as something that's abstract, but the mind precisely takes us to behavior, attitudes, how we act regarding the situation or the environment. The dissertation you gave us today takes me to the following proposal. One of the weaknesses we have as human beings is that when we have knowledge regarding something, we tend to put ourselves in that category. We put ourselves in a box, part of that dogma, and we believe that's the only truth. And that's what has been confirmed throughout history regarding injustices, exclusion, and the different situations Professor has been explaining. So my question, I don't know if we will talk about this tomorrow, because we were going from the general to the specific aspects. So from knowledge we have and we have acquired during our lifetime and day-to-day life the behavior in which we see ourselves that we have the truth, that we have a dogma, that we are in a box. Maybe that's a deviation. Sometimes if we are part of Islamic religion, we condemn Christians. If we are Christians, we condemn Yorubas. If we are Yorubas, we believe those who don't follow that spirituality in a bad way. So how do we get out of that box? And secondly, this was in the second session, I think, one of the issues I think we haven't discussed that much, it was mentioned by a friend recently, we do not know that Jesus, at a certain moment, was in India. He traveled to India, and those are completely invisible within the Catholic religion. They are mentioned in the Islamic religion, as my friend was mentioning, because she's Muslim, but I don't know if you could say something regarding that. Maybe you have some information or theory regarding that. Thank you very much to the Simon Bolivar Institute and the IVIC and everyone that's always here as militants in this third seminar of reparations, slavery, and colonization. Thank you.
Hi, yes. Okay, let me first start by saying to the brother, people who are not professors can also say a good thing. I'm not a professor. I'm not in the academia. But responding to your questions, tomorrow I will deal with the practical consequences and the theoretical consequences of decolonizing the mind. For example, on the theoretical level, I'll talk about imagining a new world. Where are we going? What can we see the coming years? And on the practical level, what can we do as an individual, as an organization, regarding skills, attitude, mental state, etc. So I'll come to that tomorrow. I just Googled, was Jesus in India? So I didn't know. Google says between the age of 12 and 29, he had visited India and Nepal for spiritual enlightenment, inspiring from Hinduism. I don't know if it's true, but this is what I saw. But what I've learned is that I don't know a lot of things. That is what I know. When I wrote this book in the past 12 years, I have a database where I take the book and make notes and copy and so forth. I did that of 1,000 books. But I have a digital library of 40,000 books. I can't read them all. So what I have learned is this. There are people out there who know much more than me. So what I do, I look at these people and I try to go close to them. I give you an example. I do a lot of lecturings and so. And in December, before the publication of the book, the University of Pennsylvania in US invited me to give a Zoom lecture. No, I give a Zoom lecture. This is what I'm going to say about the book. This philosophy, blah, blah, blah. And a few days later, a guy from South Africa was in the Zoom meeting. His name is Basi Antia. He's a professor in Cape Town University. He emails me, calls me, saying, I want to have a conversation with you about what I heard. You told me about the concepts of terminology, the things that I explained here. He says, I'm an applied linguistic. And I said to myself, what is applied linguistic? I don't know what it is. So you want to learn from me, but I even know what you are. So I don't want to be stupid. So I don't say I don't know what applied linguistics was. I say, oh yeah, linguistics is about language, and grammar, and he corrects me. So no, applied linguistics is really a different thing. And then I said, yes, let's try to work and let's try to see what we can do. And then I made an appointment for a discussion. Before I do that, I go to internet, I download book, I see what are the menus of applied linguistics so that at least I am prepared for it. So the next time he comes, you know what? You can read a book, but you don't mean that you can understand it. You read it, but you have to work with it, to understand. This guy works with it, so he does better. So then he explains to me how he uses DTM in his work, that applied linguistics is about how language and society interacts. And then he says, for example, if you analyze speeches of a president, you can find things in how they colonize in their mind. So I did a tour, Sitla and I did a tour in May in South Africa, and he invited me to come to Cape Town. I said, okay, I thought, I'd go to Cape Town and I have a lecture and so. And then he says to me, look, I've reserved 2 days for you. I have a small conference. But I thought this was the only lecture, and I go to touristic things with Titla. Go to the wines, but now I have to say, I can't say to the guy, I can't come. So I said, oh my, I might lose 2 days. So I go there, and then it was in a hotel, a very nice hotel. There were 2 PhD students from the University of Ghana, one from Cameroon, and he was there. And then for 2 days, they explained to me what is applied linguistics and how are they going to use DTM. I wrote a book about DTM. You think I'm the expert. So he explains that. And then, the guy says, what we need to do next is write new textbooks. New textbooks about economic theory, about history, So this guy was already thinking beyond me about what to do. I said, no, of course, it's a good idea, we should do it. So we leave, and my idea is, a lot of people say a lot of things, but they never follow up. So just yesterday ago, I got a letter from him saying, okay, we are going to apply for a fund now to organize a conference to write textbooks on 3 disciplines, economics, biology, and things. And cross fingers that we get it, then you go April next year in South Africa, and we do a year-long project based on DTM to develop new textbooks. So the guy has something that, what is the next step? If you criticize, how does a new economic textbook look like, which we should put in the universities? So what I learned from this is, there are people there who are more intelligent and better than you. Try to get close to them, and you can learn a lot. Thank you very much. So that's it for my answer.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Sandew, por su intervención del día de hoy, las reflexiones tan importantes que nos deja, como nos ha dejado todos estos días de esta semana. Tenemos una pregunta de...
We have a question from Zoom, but because of time, we will not ask it today. We will do that tomorrow. Before starting with the closing session, any other questions will be addressed before we start the following session. Please, those who are via Zoom, if you can come here to our headquarters for the closure of the seminar, if you have the opportunity, please come so we can share in person all the final reflections on what we have studied so far. Thank you for the simultaneous translation team, the streaming team, the protocol team, the Ministry of Science and Technology, and every one of you that were in person and connected via Zoom. See you tomorrow.